Hopefully we've got people joining now. I can see the number of participants going up, so we might just wait a few minutes.
Wow.
Hi everyone, thanks for joining. We've got about 50 participants on the line and it's still going up, so we'll just wait for a minute or two until that stops climbing. Well, we might make a start. I can see that we've lost one of our panelists, Karen Christie, but hopefully she can join again shortly. So thanks very much for everyone for joining. We've had a lot of interest in the webinar. My name is Matthew Harrison. I work at the University of Tasmania in the Northwest. We're joined by my colleagues, Rowan Eisner, she's in Launceston, Caroline Brown, who's with the Department of Natural Resources and Environment in Launceston, as well as Karen Christie, who's an expert in farming systems modelling. She's not here at the moment, but I'm hoping that she can join very shortly. I'll just see if I can share my screen. Hopefully people can see that. What we'll talk about today is the first session, which goes for about 40 minutes, is an introduction to carbon farming. So it's carbon farming 101, types of greenhouse gas emission, as well as market risks and some cautions on trading soil carbon. We'll talk about, we'll hand over to Rowan then for about 5 or 10 minutes, and she'll talk about greenhouse gas emissions associated with land use change, which are particularly large but often overlooked. Caroline Brown will then talk about the carbon farming advice rebate program, which is specific to Tasmania. We'll have a short break at about 10 o'clock Australian Eastern Standard Time. Karen Christie, assuming she can join us again, we'll talk about carbon accounting tools, as well as self-assessment approaches for calculating your own greenhouse gas emissions, and she'll go through a worked example. We've got a little poll at the end, as well as polls interspliced throughout the presentation. Then we've got a session at the end for question and answer. So the first question, now I'm going to have to stop presenting in order to get this to work.
Sorry, Matt, we weren't seeing your screen share anyway.
So you weren't seeing my screen sharing just then, Clinton, is that right?
No, no screen share.
Can you see the poll now? I'm assuming people can see it because I'm getting responses. So in a typical workshop setting, normally we would do these workshops face to face, and we get people to talk to each other and learn about how they're going, learn where they're from and what type of enterprise they run. Obviously, we can't do that in a webinar setting. So the purpose of these polls was really for us to learn about who's here, and hopefully when I end this poll, you'll learn about who else is on the line. So I'll just wait another 10 seconds for people to complete answering the poll. We've got about 65 responses now. We've got 83 people on the line. Just wait it for another, and that's still climbing. Just wait for another couple of seconds.
There's no option for New Zealand, it says.
No, there's not, unfortunately, but thanks very much to the New Zealand people for joining. So I'll hit end poll now, and I'm hopeful, having not being a participant, that you should be able to see the results now. Can people see results now? People can't answer. There we go. We've got a yes, so that's good. So in terms of the people that are on the line today, well, we've sort of got an equal distribution. We've got majority of people from New South Wales, Victoria. We've got a distribution of Tasmanians, so southern Tasmanian, the northwest. The WA people, you know, it's pretty slack. It's probably 7 AM in the morning, so that might account for the low distribution of 3% of WA people and even less in South Australia. So now I have a second poll question, and I'll see if I can launch this one. We're particularly interested in why you attended this webinar today. Is it because you want to measure your own farm emissions? Is it because you're an advisor? Is it because you want to learn more? Is it because you know the speakers? Or is it because you thought there was free beer and nuts? I've just dropped my phone.
Some of the options you might need to scroll down for. %, thought there would be free beer and nuts.
Perhaps we shouldn't have had that option, Rowan, but there's a lot of people that seem
I'll see
to
if I
think
can
there would have been.
rustle up some virtual beer and nuts, but I'm not quite sure how to share it.
You could maybe get a picture of a beer and circulate that by email, perhaps a free beer token. It's good to see that a lot of people have replied to this one. We've got nearly 80 responses, which is good. So if people are just joining, and it does still look like that people are still joining the webinar, we've got a poll question on the line. So if you could just answer that. Rowan, would you be able to give Karen a call and just see if she can join us again?
Oh, can you put a number in the chat? Oh, that's just to me.
So I'm just going to share results now of that last poll, and hopefully people will be able to see the results of the poll that we just ran any second on their screen. So feel free to let us know if you can see it in the chat. Most people are attending today because they want to learn about greenhouse gas emissions. We've got some advisors on the line who will use this information for their clients. Some people come for a refresher. Some people come because they want to know how to make their business carbon neutral. Some people are thinking about trading carbon credits. Other people are interested in measuring and reducing their farm's emissions. So there's an equal distribution there. Some people thought there would have been free beer and nuts, which is maybe in a face-to-face setting next time. I think we've got one more poll question, and then we'll get on to the presentation. So I'll just launch. Now this question here is mainly for farmers. We're interested in your production system or your enterprise. Are you a beef farmer or a dairy farmer? Viticulture, broadacre cropping. If you're not a farmer, there's an option there at the end. I'll just wait for about a minute for people to answer that. We've just had a comment in the chat from Veronica. She's looking at Tasmanian economic opportunities, which just cut off, and I didn't see the full thing. So I'll just wait for another second. It looks like we've got a high proportion of farmers on the line, which is good, about 70 people. I'll just share those results now. And hopefully people can see them coming up on the screen any second. The majority, about 50% of people are not farmers on the line. We've got probably mainly beef farmers, sheep, about an equal distribution of sheep for sheep production for wool and meat. We've got broadacre cropping, not many horticulture and viticulture people, and some dairy farmers on the line, as well as other sorts of farmers. Now, I'm going to see if I can share my screen. Clinton, you'll have to tell me if this doesn't work, because it sounds like it didn't work the first time.
Yep,
you
that's
see that
working.
now? Okay, good. Yep.
Yeah, I can see that.
That was the agenda. Hopefully that pops up on people's screens. I've already talked about that. We will have a break at about 10 a.m. or slightly thereafter, so for the people who missed my introductory comments. So what does carbon neutrality really mean? About 20% of people who are attending today were interested in what carbon neutrality really means and how they can get it for their business. So all farms have sources and sinks of greenhouse gas emissions. A source is something like enteric methane or methane from manure. You can have nitrous oxide. If you're a cropping business, your main greenhouse gas emission is probably nitrous oxide from fertilizers. And there's carbon dioxide to a lesser extent. And so that's things from, for example, using diesel fuel, from liming and from electricity. Sources of greenhouse gas emissions can be reduced. So you can actually reduce the rate of emissions. They can be avoided by terminating the process that actually produces those emissions. So for example, fattening livestock faster and getting them off the farm earlier would be avoiding a source of greenhouse gas emissions. Greenhouse gas emissions can be offset by, if you're a farm, you can purchase carbon credits from outside the farm, which is not really sustainable and probably won't be legal in future. They can also be inset, which means you generate sources of carbon inside your farm boundaries. Then we've got sinks. And if you think of a kitchen sink and put carbon, you put water down the drain, a sink actively removes carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So you've got things like carbon sequestration in trees and in soils. So carbon neutrality or carbon neutral or net zero in international language is the point at which emissions from sources less your offsets equals your emissions from the sinks. And that's measured on a year-by-year basis. So some years your business might be carbon negative, other years it might be carbon positive. And so it's typically measured on a year-by-year basis. So a farm could be a high emitter, could have a high production of nitrous oxide or methane, but it still could be carbon neutral because you've got a high proportion of carbon sinks and or you purchase carbon credits. So I took this photo the other day because I think it really illustrates the complexity in a farm when thinking about biological sources of carbon. So on the left, we've got a high carbon landscape. So you've got perennial shrubs that have been there since, for probably the last 100 years. You've got mallee trees as well. On the right, you've got a low carbon landscape. On the left, you've got no crop production. And on the right, you've got crop production, which is a source of cash flow and prosperity. On the left, you've got high biodiversity, relatively high biodiversity. And on the right, you've got low biodiversity. Probably the point I would make is that a carbon neutral farm doesn't necessarily mean that every paddock has to be carbon neutral. Can you identify fence lines or low production gullies or other area or saline areas of your farm that are not necessarily used for agricultural production, for example, cropping, that you could use as a carbon sink, particularly for perennial shrubs or planting trees? So just a few notes about terminology. So a carbon account is different to a carbon footprint. A carbon account is net emissions per farm or tonnes of CO2 per business. And that's typically divided into scopes. So we think about scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 emissions. Scope 1 is easy. That's the direct emissions associated with your farm. Scope 2 is typically indirect and upstream emissions associated with electricity usage. And scope 3 is both upstream and downstream. So that's associated with other purchased inputs. So the actual manufacture and transport of your herbicides and your fertilizers can be upstream and downstream. So if you think about it, that one in the center, and I don't know if people can see my mouse, but the one in the center is scope 1, which is direct emissions associated with your farm. Scope 2 is that black arrow, which is typically upstream electricity. Scope 3 is more complex and it's both upstream and downstream. So if you're thinking about a carbon neutral business, you only really have to report scope 2, upstream, and scope 3, which is upstream, and scope 1, direct emissions associated with your farm, and stop at the farm gate. If you're thinking about a carbon neutral product, carbon neutral grain, or carbon neutral milk, or carbon neutral steak, you have to report scope 3 emissions associated with transport post farm gate to the supermarket. So it depends on whether you're thinking about a carbon neutral business or a carbon neutral product, which are different. A carbon footprint is, people probably heard of emissions intensity, is net emissions per unit product. And so, as I just said, that includes life cycle of all products produced, and it includes pre-farm emissions. So now I'll attempt to do poll questions 4 and 5. And hopefully in a minute or two, people should start to see another question appear on their screen. So what's the most abundant greenhouse gas emission in the atmosphere today? Hopefully you can just select one option. So we can see that people are starting to put responses in there, which is good. In terms of real-time results, I can see that, well, I won't say because that might bias your thinking. So we just wait for another 30 seconds for people to hit an option there. What do you think is the most abundant greenhouse gas emission in the atmosphere today? Just select one of those options. Is it carbon dioxide? Is it methane? Is it nitrous oxide? Is it water vapour? Is it ozone? Is it halogenated gases? So we have about 85 responses. We've now got 113 people on the line, so we've got about 3/4 of responses. So I'll wait for another second. Now, hopefully I can share those results, and hopefully people can see that come up on their screen in a minute. Most people assume that the most abundant greenhouse gas emission in the atmosphere today is carbon dioxide. 7% of people think it's methane, 5% of people nitrous oxide, 19% of people water vapour. The answer is actually water vapour. Water vapour is the most abundant greenhouse gas emission in the atmosphere today. Probably the thing to point out is that water vapour contributes to a positive feedback loop. So the more water vapour in the atmosphere, the warmer the atmosphere becomes. And the warmer the atmosphere becomes, the more water vapour goes into the atmosphere. So that's called a positive feedback loop. Water vapour is the most abundant, followed by carbon dioxide, followed by methane, followed by nitrous oxide, and to a lesser extent, ozone and CFCs. I'll see if I can launch another poll question. So what's the most, so if you've got a livestock farm, what's the most common greenhouse gas emission of a typical livestock farm? Is it carbon dioxide? Is it methane? Is it nitrous oxide? Is it ozone? Or is it nitrogen trifluoride? So just wait a minute. So we got some quick responses, which is good. So I'll hit end poll and I'll see if I can share these results. So most people, 86% of people say that it's methane, which is correct. So it's mainly enteric methane and to a lesser extent manure methane. And the proportions there are 9% for carbon dioxide and about 4% for nitrous oxide. And that's probably roughly in line with the actual proportions of a typical livestock farm. Now, so why would you reduce emissions? Well, there's a number of reasons why you might want to reduce emissions. You can obviously get income from carbon in compliance with voluntary schemes, and about 20% of people, I think, attending today are for that reason. There's opportunities to participate in low carbon or carbon neutral branded supply chains. So there's a big difference between selling your carbon for money and keeping your carbon to market a carbon neutral product. There's increased domestic and international market access. Increased access to finance borrowing options. So the banks, for example, have a number of options for green loans or sustainability loans. So you can get particularly low interest rates if you're embarking on sustainability activities such as planting trees or doing something else which will improve the sustainability of your farm. And there's other loans that have low interest rates for looking at carbon farming. So all of the big banks have all sorts of options in agribusiness in that respect. Carbon prices could go up in future. We've seen in the last probably 6 months, carbon prices have gone up from about $20 a tonne Australian to I think 54 now. EU prices are about $90 a tonne, 90 euro a tonne, which is obviously a carrot. You've got improved social licence, so customer and public rapport for the agricultural sector. Income from biodiversity conservation, so that's changing by the day. There could potentially be credits from biodiversity schemes. There's a number of pilots underway. The Land Restoration Fund is not a pilot in Queensland, which has been going for a long time, but Tasmania has got the carbon and biodiversity pilot. We've got the Tasmanian Action Land Care grants, and Caroline Brown will talk briefly about another Tasmanian carbon farming scheme later on in the webinar. The government could introduce a carbon pollution tax. So if you produce more than 2,000 tonnes of CO2 equivalents per year, or more than that, you might be taxed. And we've seen similar things in Europe with nitrates. So if you do more than 200 kilograms of mineral N per hectare per year, you can be taxed. And New Zealand has similar for nitrates. So, you know, there's potential there for the same thing to be introduced with respect to emissions in future. And there could be other government regulations on agriculture if it fails to reduce its emissions. So there's a number of different ways you can reduce your carbon sources. So remember, I introduced carbon sources and carbon sinks at the start of the presentation. Probably the first thing I would mention is that there's a lot of options. So it's first important to think about what enterprise you run. If you're a livestock farm, your main emission, as we saw in the poll, would be methane. So if you're thinking about reducing emissions, you're better off focusing on what ways do you have for reducing enteric methane. And so that could be things like improving growth rates of juvenile animals so that you sell them earlier and you avoid emissions. You can better match stocking rate to ground cover. You can cull unproductive animals from the herd or the flock. Feed digestibility, it's in fact the opposite to humans. If you improve the digestibility and the metabolizable energy of the diet so they put on live weight faster, which is what you want, that tends to reduce emissions. Humans is the opposite. You want sort of increased fiber and less digestible energy in the diet. There's low emissions feed supplements, so things like 3-NOP. Production of Asparagopsis or red seaweed is ramping up. There's anti-methanogenic legumes, so things like Leucaena and Desmanthus in the north, bird's foot trefoil in the south, which are obviously, you know, perennial and they grow as well. So you've got forage production as well. If you're a dairy or a piggery, you could think about manure management methods, anaerobic digesters. There's a lot of research underway in low methane genetics, animal genetics, as well as methane vaccines and a rumen bolus. I'm not aware of anything commercially available. There's an emissions reduction fund method in reducing methane from dams or wetlands. So that's actually reducing nutrients entering a dam or fencing off wetlands so that you reduce emissions associated with the dam or the wetland. If you're a cropping business, your main sort of emission, your major greenhouse gas emissions is probably nitrous oxide. So you want to think about nitrogen fertilizer management. So there's the old mantra of rate, timing, source, placement, and then you've got your inhibitors as well. So rates are important. You don't want to apply nitrogen when the soil's saturated. You want to avoid soil compaction, potentially avoid cultivation. Try to retain crop stubble, although that's not always possible. Avoid burning crop stubble. If you're in the north, there's savanna burning methods. Basically, the people talk about cool burns, which is burning when the weather is cool or early in the dry season rather than late in the dry season. That avoids late, hot, intense fires. Just reduce fossil fuel usage where possible. Think about renewable energy, so agrivoltaics. Then there's collaborative supply chain arrangements. So that's called aggregation. So you can group together with like farmers or like producers, so that enables a more consistent supply for meat or milk processors. But it also mitigates risk. So it mitigates financial, environmental and market risk if you group together. So I've talked about reducing carbon sources. Now I'm going to talk about increasing carbon sinks. So you can transition. I can see that 2 people have raised their hand. A point that I should make is that there'll be an opportunity for questions at the end. If you've got any questions before then, we've got four hands raised now. Please put them in the Q&A or the chat, and we'll endeavour to answer them throughout the course of the webinar. You can transition from cropping to permanent pastures, which is basically increasing root depth so that soil organic matter gets deeper and improves rather than ripping it up every so often. You can improve soil fertility. Consider clay delving if you've got a non-wetting sand, although that can be highly variable. So just do a little test before you do the whole farm. Remediate acid soils, incorporate legumes. Think about deep-rooted perennials. If you push that root frontier deeper than it was ever before, you'll improve soil carbon because you've pushed carbon down deeper into the soil profile. Undertake new irrigation. So soil carbon is not a magical thing. It's just related to what happens above ground. If you increase above ground production, you generally increase below ground production. But if you stop irrigation, your soil carbon will probably go down. Plant trees appropriate to the region. So you've got reforestation, afforestation, agroforestry. You've got things like organic amendments. So you could spread biochar, obviously for smaller paddocks, or you can feed it as a supplement. So we're doing biochar feeding trials to calves. And dung beetles. Dung beetles are very good. So think about monitoring them where you can, or introducing new and active dung beetle populations. So they basically incorporate organic matter into the soil and improve soil carbon. Probably important to point out though that carbon farming can have both co-benefits and trade-offs. So the direct aim of carbon farming is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but you can have co-benefits, which are positive spin-offs and negative adverse trade-offs as well. So we published a paper in a prestigious journal called Global Change Biology. If people want a copy of that, it's online, but if that's a long link, if you want a copy, let me know and we can send it out later. Some of the things that we talk about in that paper are improved livestock productivity from carbon farming in some contexts, environmental plantings, so planting trees can improve biodiversity. They can improve water quality, reduce salinity. Trees and shrubs can improve livestock, can provide livestock shade and shelter, which can improve livestock productivity as well. Improving soil carbon increases water holding capacity and in some contexts can improve drought resilience. Some livestock supplements which reduce enteric methane actually may improve livestock feed use efficiency, so the rate at which they put on live weight. So there's a recent example in Tasmania. This is what a shelter belt looks like. I think it's Evandale is the location. The Dutch founders, I think in the 1950s or thereabouts, planted these shelter belts, and the current farming generation thought they were so successful that they were planting more shelter belts. And talking about co-benefits, the ewes that were in those paddocks, the farmers said that they had higher landmarking percentage. So if you've got higher landmarking percentage, you're getting an improvement in productivity. If you get an improvement in productivity, you've made a profit generally. So although you've probably planted it for carbon mitigation, you've also got improvement in livestock production. And there's other examples of new shelter belt schemes going in southern Tasmania. It also has trade-offs though. So it can be difficult to improve soil carbon where it's already high. So about 5 or 6% can be difficult to improve it above that. Soil carbon can be lost during drought. So you might be required to pay back credits in some schemes. Not all greenhouse gas emissions mitigation options are officially recognised by the Commonwealth, although that's changing. Mitigation and sequestration usually comes with a cost. So to plant trees comes with a cost. You need to ensure permanence. So that means you've got to ensure that the carbon, if you're enrolled in a carbon farming scheme, stays there for 25 or even 100 years, depending on the scheme, but that can be set back by bushfire or drought. You need to ensure additionality. Now we get a lot of comments about additionality. People generally don't like it, but that means you have to show that the greenhouse gas emissions mitigation or the additional carbon that's sequestered is additional to what would have happened in the absence of your intervention or your change. And things like improved feed conversion efficiency. So if you improve soil carbon and you improve pasture production, then you increase stocking rate, then you've probably increased enteric methane. So just be aware of adverse trade-offs and think about the system holistically rather than thinking about just carbon or just methane. So you might be planting shelter belts or plantations for animal shading. The only problem with that, an adverse trade-off might be if you've got too many animals in the paddock or you've kept them there for too long, they can camp there. And because they prefer the shade, you can erode ground cover. And if it's a fragile soil, you lose ground cover, you lose soil carbon. So you've sequestered carbon in the trees, but you've lost carbon in the soil. So just be aware of, where animals are camping, I guess. Now I have, I think, another 2 polls. So I'll just see if I can launch this number 6. Hopefully people will see this poll come up on their screen shortly. Which of these practices generally improves soil carbon? Planting trees, irrigating land that was previously rain-fed, adding more nitrogen, grazing harder or for longer, spreading biochar, converting from perennials to annuals, or cultivation. You can select as many as you like. It's good to see, Karen, that you've joined us again.
Thanks, Matt. Yes, we had a blimp in power just as we went live, and so I've had to hotspot in, so lost all internet.
Oh, well, if your presentation, if you can't present for whatever reason, well, we might just have to cut the webinar short, but see how you go.
Yep, all good at the moment, so we will see.
Yeah, good. So we've got about 80 responses. So it's about 3/4 of people. We'll just wait another 15 seconds. People just select as many options as they like. Hopefully they can see that poll window on the screen. So I'll just share the results now. So the question was, which of these practices generally improves soil carbon? A lot of people said planting trees. About 60% of people said irrigating. 20% of people said adding more nitrogen. Hardly anyone said grazing harder or for longer. Some people said spreading biochar. 20% of people converting from perennials to annuals, and some people said cultivation. So the practices that reduce soil carbon are grazing harder and for longer. So most people had that exactly right. Cultivation reduces soil carbon. The more you rip up, the more you destroy organic matter, the more you reduce soil carbon in general. The question as to which of those increases soil carbon the most is very much depending on where you are, your production system and the existing state. So spreading biochar adds carbon, irrigating rain-fed land adds soil carbon, adding more nitrogen fertilizer, that also adds soil carbon, and planting trees, as long as they're endemic or suitable to the region, that also increases soil carbon. So most people were spot on there. I'll move on to the next part of the presentation. I've only got one more part to go, which is cautions on trading soil carbon. And I'll hand over to my colleague Rowan Eisner to talk about emissions associated with land use change. So not all soil carbon is created equally. So you've got plant residues, you've got particulate organic carbon, you've got humus, then you've got recalcitrant or inert carbon. So soil carbon schemes tend to focus on permanence. Hopefully people can still see my screen. I've talked about that before. So it's usually a 25-year minimum period that the soil carbon has to be in the soil, or even up to 100 years, depending on the soil. But soil carbon storage mainly occurs through inert carbon. You've got particulate organic carbon and humus, which turn over fast, but that's not in the soil for long. So you can't really rely on particulate organic carbon and humus in terms of permanence. But particulate organic carbon and humus improve soil fertility and they improve soil carbon. So you've just improved plant growth. So you've got this trade-off between inert carbon for permanence, and you've got the short, fast turnover soil carbon pools, which aid soil fertility. So just be aware of the differences between them. One improves fertility and water holding capacity, the short-term stuff. The long-term stuff doesn't really do a lot for fertility, but will be in the soil for long. So the productivity co-benefits from humus and particulate organic carbon are usually a lot more than the financial returns compared with income from trading carbon. Now, those assessments were done with an Australian carbon price of $20 a tonne. That's probably quite different now that carbon prices are nearly 3 times as much. But we've shown that in past work that productivity, particularly with high red meat prices, is usually worth a lot more than income from carbon. In the absence of land use change, so if you think about a 100-year period, soil carbon, most soil carbon stocks, not sequestration, mostly follows rainfall. So if you get a drought, your above ground dry matter production drops and your below ground dry matter production drops. So your soil carbon will also go down. Soil fertility is a big one. So soil carbon doesn't come as an element, soil carbon comes as a bundle. So it comes with oxygen, hydrogen, phosphorus and sulfur. So if you want to build up soil carbon, you also have to build up those other elements. Soil carbon doesn't come on its own. And some soil carbon schemes, not all, but some, require participants to pay back credits if your soil carbon stocks go down. So what's the likelihood of getting a drought in a 25-year period? And depending on where you are, probably quite high. So the one thing I would say there, and really this applies to all carbon and biological carbon trading schemes, is just to do your research before you commit. Do you know anyone who's already involved in a carbon trading scheme? And can you talk to them before you commit? So just talk to people who've got nothing to gain financially from involvement in carbon trading schemes. We published a conversation article, so that's online. If you just Google that heading, you'll get it. And that was about a recent high-profile deal done between Microsoft and a big property in Central Australia, where the soil carbon was estimated remotely, mainly remotely, with few on-ground measurements, and was potentially overestimated. So just be aware of the risks. And so just to finish up, so soil carbon can be, you can get carbon neutrality by reducing emissions or increasing carbon sequestration or both. There's a lot of different options. So think about what enterprise you have and what your main sources of emissions are if you're thinking about reducing emissions. There's no panacea, there's no silver bullet. So it very much depends on your production system, your agroecological region, as well as your existing state. If your soil carbon is already 6 or 7%, you probably haven't got much potential to improve it anymore. So you're better off focusing on other avenues. If you're in Northern Australia, well, you can think about savanna burning. If you're in Tasmania, you probably can't. The value of co-benefits is often worth more than the income from carbon per se, although that will probably change if carbon prices keep on going up. Practices that improve production efficiency are often effective at reducing emissions and improving profitability. Trading soil carbon can expose participants to economic risk. The other thing is, if you sell soil carbon to the voluntary market, you've lost those carbon credits. You can't count those carbon credits in being a carbon neutral business. So if you're thinking about marketing carbon neutral grain or beef or milk, you can't really do it because you've sold your credits and someone else is using those credits to offset their business. If you sell it to the government, well, that's different. You can potentially count it as part of your business. So think about, do you want to market a carbon neutral product or do you want to gain income from the carbon per se? Really, carbon farming is just good practice. If you're not involved in trading, that's okay, because carbon farming usually works in the same direction as sustainability and improved productivity. So we're lucky, it's the same direction. So I'm going to stop there. Now I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Rowan Eisner. And I'm hoping, Rowan, that if I stop sharing, you should be able to share your screen now.
Great, thanks. I haven't got one to share yet, but I just got starting off with a question. Whether you have an idea, if you think about your farm on the landscape, this is for people that have a farm, or if you don't have a farm, thinking about a typical farm, do you have an idea of the main source? Now, putting aside for a moment what Matt has said, because Matt was talking about carbon emissions, I'm talking about carbon footprint. If you think about that landscape and what that landscape would look like if you weren't there, or farming wasn't there, the picture is a bit different from what we get when we do emissions. We measure emissions using a tool. So I took some students out to University Farm yesterday, we did a carbon accounting exercise for the university forum yesterday, and we did a rough assessment of it, and it looks like it was about 65% land use and about 35% emissions. And the thing is that when we talk about the sort of figures that Matt was talking about and sort of figures that you get out of the carbon accounting tools, they only talk about your emissions for that year, not for the whole footprint of your enterprise. And if you think about the whole footprint of your enterprise, it can include all the loss of vegetation that is as a result of having that enterprise on that land. And that's about 8 tonnes per hectare. Maybe, I mean, it's very different in different places, but from loss of vegetation, typically in Tasmania, if you look at it through one of the carbon accounting tools, it's about 8 tonnes per hectare that you could get if you revegetated it. So in some ways, that is part of your carbon footprint, but it's not accounted for in the tool. So I thought I'll just end the poll and you can see what people said. So obviously you're very good at listening and you heard Matt say that it's enteric emissions, and obviously you thought it was enteric emissions because there's a lot of talking about that, and that is a major source, but it's an even bigger source, occupying land. And it's an issue because you have a choice about how much land you occupy, how efficiently do you use that land. And we don't typically measure that, not with our carbon accounting measures. And for livestock, we don't even typically measure it from our yield perspective. So if you ask a cropping farmer what their yield is, they'll typically be able to tell you in terms of tonnes per hectare. But often livestock producers will talk about yield in terms of kilograms per animal or something like that, and leave the land use out as though it doesn't make any difference whether you use 1 hectare or 1,000 hectares, it's all the same. But obviously from a carbon sequestration point of view, there's a big difference. So it's important to count it. So how did this happen? What were the origins of carbon footprinting? Well, if you think about what is a footprint, if you sort of put aside this idea of carbon footprinting, which is a reasonably new idea, if you think about what's the footprint of your building or something like that, we've used this term forever, and it means the amount of space that you take up on the land. And before carbon footprinting, there was ecological footprinting, and that is where the origins of carbon footprinting came from. So BP invented carbon footprinting originally, and they based it on ecological footprinting, and they wanted a measure that would encourage individuals or enterprises or corporations to take responsibility for carbon emissions, to deflect responsibility from the petrochemical industry and from BP in particular. So it's been a phenomenally successful marketing campaign, and here we are all doing it now, and we have to do it. That's the way the world has turned out. So the interesting thing is, why was land use left out of carbon emissions? When we talk about carbon emissions, why is land use left out? Well, one point of view of that is that we're only looking for the last, you measure year by year, and you look at what's happened in the last year. And you've got emissions in the last year, but the land was cleared a long time ago, so we just don't count that. And, in some senses, I guess in some parts of the world, maybe the land was cleared a very long time ago. You can see how that would make a certain sense. But from the point of view of trying to fix the greenhouse gas problem, it's critically important that we don't leave it out, because we can make maybe about a third of the difference, maybe a third to a half of the difference of the amount of greenhouse gas is in the atmosphere by our land use. So it's really important to include it. And I think there are moves around that, recognizing that, hey, hang on a minute, are we doing this right? So things may change down the track, and it will make a really big difference if and when they do. So one of the things for you to think about is, why are you doing this and what are you interested in? Because if you're interested in doing it in order to get a tick in the current systems, or to be able to use it from a marketing point of view, or to trade or so on, then what you're probably most interested in is the results that you get out of the standard tools. But if you're interested mostly in doing something about the problem of greenhouse gas our greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, then you probably want to think about land use. Land use is probably where you can make the most difference. Obviously, we really need to bring down emissions because we need to reduce the amount of carbon in the atmosphere. And if we offset our emissions, then we continuing to emit while we sequester. And we need that sequestering to reduce the concentrations in the atmosphere. So it's quite important to not just keep emitting, but to reduce our emissions too. And in fact, I'd say that was the best place to start anyway. It's just a measuring issue in a way. We talked about how Matt's talked a bit about how you can make a difference. I would say that the most important thing is your land use efficiency. So if you reduce the amount of land that you use and then use any land that you don't need for production, revegetate it, that's how you're going to get the best answer from a carbon point of view for that area of land. But don't sacrifice any production. It's important not to sacrifice production because this is a global problem. If you reduce your production, clearly we could get the best carbon outcome by just not using the land for farming anymore and revegetating everything. That's a really bad answer because we need the food. So the easiest way to think about it is to keep your production at least the same, but try and use the land as efficiently as possible, and obviously reduce enteric emissions where you can as well. Often the things that you do to reduce your land use by increasing food quantity will also reduce enteric emissions as well. So what's the best measure? I was going to just share one slide. How can I do this? Just to explain how we got here a little bit. If you can see that. So why might this have happened? So one of the reasons goes back to the Kyoto Protocol. At the Kyoto Protocol, we had 1990 as a baseline year, and that was something that Australia pushed for extremely hard. It was our highest level at the time of deforestation. And so because deforestation was going down, it meant that we could meet our commitments under the Kyoto Protocol without reducing any of our actual emissions. So it was considered an extreme victory for Australia that we got 1990 as the baseline year. Then when we went to the Paris Accords, they changed it to 2005 because that was also an extremely high year. And another way of showing it, you could look this up later if you're interested, is our deforestation rates and where our baseline years are chosen from. But just to show you that actually, if you look at other countries, even countries that haven't normally been really trying to reduce their emissions that much, like the United States, have had a tendency to go down, whereas Australia has still been going up if you exclude land use. So although the Prime Minister has said that we've had a, whatever it was, a 19% in emissions reduction, that's entirely from what's been happening on the land, the sorts of things that you guys have been doing anyway. They're just counting that, and that means that they don't have to decarbonize the economy. Which is a real problem. Okay, so the best measure. What is the best measure to use? Well, it's the emissions in terms of per unit of production. So if you're producing a kilogram of beef, how much emissions did that beef take to produce? That's also called emissions intensity. But you need to include the land use in that measure, and the way that it's done, the IPCC says to do it because obviously that happened, maybe one time a long time ago, is that you split it up over a 20-year period because it takes about 20 years to grow the carbon back, and obviously that would be different in different parts of the world and depending on the vegetation type and so on. But anyway, that's one way of doing it, and it certainly has some measures. We have measured it that way and had it published and so on. So from a scientific point of view, that's an acceptable way of doing it. What I would say for now, because maybe you're doing that sort of measure, it's not in the calculators. If you want to really have a good feel for how you're doing, I would say know your yield. and in terms of amount of produce per hectare. And I'd just like to ask who thinks they know this. So I've got another poll question here. If you're a livestock producer or you know about livestock production, can you give an idea of what you think your yield in terms of wool or beef or lamb is per hectare? And when you think about per hectare, you need to include all of the land that's used for that production, including sheds and roads and so on, but not any land that's under natural vegetation, because that's not being used to produce your product. That's being used to produce vegetation instead. So it's really a measure of the emissions for that. So I think this is it's quite interesting. Not so many people have answered. Let me just see. 30, 35 people or so have answered. I might let people are still answering. I'll leave that going. So if you don't include your land use in the figure, then that means essentially that land is not valued. It's not taken into account. It makes no difference how much you use. And that clearly it makes a big difference from a carbon point of view, from a biodiversity point of view. And I think, as Matt was saying, also from a production point of view, if you use things efficiently, it's generally better from a production point of view as well, I think. So I think it could also be good for your bottom line. But that would be an interesting one if anyone's interested in exploring whether that is true or not. Just to give you a rough benchmark, when we studied it, we found that we got between 33 and 200 kilograms per hectare for beef. They were the extremes, so a very, very low intensity farm would produce about 33, and a more high intensity farm would be 200 kilograms. That was in Latin America, so we probably do a bit better here because we've probably got more productive species here. For this spread, from CO2 emissions per kilograms of beef, it's between about 60 and 300 we got. And the spreadsheets, the sort of spreadsheets that Karen's going to show you, that might typically get about 15. So it's a huge difference. And I think I said for the university farm, it was about 65% land use. Typical sort of amount that we got was more like 80%, so more in the subtropics and the tropical areas, it makes more difference like that. I'll just, I think you might have stopped answering the questions. Who can share the results? Oh, that's still changing. So I think that's pretty much what I wanted to say. I was just going to say that for me, if I think about my footprint typically comes from my land use, which is typically my food and fiber production that's needed to support my lifestyle. It depends a little bit on what else I do. So if I take an intercontinental flight to Europe and back, that's about the same as occupying about 10 hectares of land. And a typical Westerner like myself probably occupies about 8 hectares of land. In the developing country, you might only occupy about 2 hectares. So don't forget, you get about 8 tons per hectare. So it gives you an idea. So if I fly to Europe every year, then that would be my main source. But if I need to do it every 2 years, then my land use is my main source. Okay, so that's where I think land use fits into the picture. I'll stop sharing this now so you can see the results. Most people said they didn't produce. Oh. Okay, oh, view details, sorry. Okay, I don't know if you,
yeah, so that was being shared, Rowan. It was being shared, but you can hit share again now if you want.
Okay. There we go. So I think you can see. Oh, so I'm quite interested to see who would say they'd rather not say, because some people have told me that this sort of thing is commercial in confidence. So that is interesting. People would rather not say, because I guess it's the sort of thing that if you want to get involved in this, you probably do need to be prepared to declare it. So some people say about 1 kilo per hectare, 100 kilograms per hectare. So that's sort of in the ballpark. 380, yeah. So some people know. Oh, kilograms of live weight, yeah, okay. Anyway, that's what I wanted to share. Thank you for that. And I'll stop sharing.
Thanks very much, Rowan. We just have a quick statement from Caroline Brown, who's from the Department of Natural Resources and Environment Tasmania, or NRED. She's going to talk about the carbon farming advice rebate scheme. I think it's just a brief comment, and then we'll go to a break, and then we'll come back to carbon accounting tools and some examples and an overview of existing carbon accounting tools with Karen Christie. So if you're there, Caro,
I am, yes.
Feel
Matt,
free to talk.
hopefully you can hear me okay.
Yep.
Great. Hi, everyone. So you can find the information that I'm talking about on the Natural Resources Environment Tasmania website, which is www.nre.tas.gov.au, and search for carbon farming. Now, the government made an announcement in September 2021 that it would be providing a program to improve land management through carbon farming, and 250,000 was committed towards a new carbon farming advice rebate pilot program. Under this new pilot program, primary producers are able to claim a rebate dollar for dollar of up to $10,000, excluding GST, for professional advice about the costs and benefits of accessing carbon credits, auditing requirements, or on-ground actions that are eligible for carbon credits. Eligible activities are details about carbon farming, including the regulatory framework and approved methods under the Emissions Reduction Fund, and details about the Tasmanian Land Care Action grants relating to on-ground activities that support carbon farming, or advice to guide your carbon farming project design. Now, an example of that can be where a primary producer seeks advice about the specific location of the proposed carbon farming project, including likely establishment and ongoing management requirements. This advice does need to be provided by an approved advisor, and you can look on the NRE TAS website where we do have a list of approved advisors that are currently listed as approved. There are project developers, environmental consultants, and agribusinesses spread across a range of companies, and that list is increasing. And the approved advisor can also have as part of their costs for the project report, soil carbon sampling costs, and an indicative project cost benefit analysis that helps inform the primary producer's decision to whether or not to produce or participate in carbon markets. So how do you go about it? A primary producer who wishes to seek a rebate completes an application form that's found on the NRE TAS website, and that asks for information generally about the property, the nature of the advice that you may be looking to seek, and the amount of rebate that you may look to apply for. NRE TAS then assess the application and send you a letter confirming that you're okay to proceed. Then the primary producer can seek advice from the approved advisor, as I said, who are listed on the department's website. And then if they have any questions about that, they can talk to one of our Farm Point advisors about how they can then seek a rebate for that particular report that's received by the approved advisor. But you must receive a letter confirming that you're okay to proceed by the NRE TAS if you wish to receive a rebate. Now, you may be wondering why the pilot program is asking for advisors to be approved. This is because we've modelled a Tasmanian program on the Queensland Government's Land Restoration Fund, and their experience has highlighted the importance of working with experienced advisors. And that is because carbon farming advice can be complex to consider, and the Tasmanian Government wishes to ensure that the relevant advice provided to producers is within that advisor's area of expertise. An approved advisor can be a solicitor or an accountant or a project developer. They're also known as a carbon agent, aggregator, or carbon service provider. We can also have advice provided by an environmental consultant or an agribusiness advisor. Now, as this is a pilot program, it'll remain open until all funds are expended under the program, and it is still open. So as I said, you can find out information by going to www.nretas.gov.au, or you can phone Farm Point on 1300 292 292. Now, Matt, other people might be interested in the Tasmanian Land Care Action Grants, and I can advise that you can find the information on the Tasmanian Farmers and Grazers Association website. The current round has closed, but there will be further rounds expected into 24-25. The minimum grant amount is 1,000. The preferred maximum grant is 10,000, but consideration can be given to larger projects with outstanding merit. And you can find information, as I said, on the TFGA website with regards to eligibility, and there will be further rounds even though the recent one has closed. So I'll hand back to you.
Thanks very much, Caro. Just to note that that's available for Tasmanians. It's not for the whole of Australia. Just follow up. We put some links in the chat there. Just a housekeeping item. If you've got any questions, put them in the Q&A button. It's a little bit confusing, not the chat button, simply because it's too hard to reply to direct comments in the chat, whereas you can do it directly in the Q&A. So please put any questions in the Q&A. Now we've only got one session left. So the session, this webinar doesn't go from 9 to 12. That was an actual error in advertising, but no one ever complained over a short webinar. So we've only got one session left, and that's Dr. Karen Christie. She's going to talk about give an overview of some existing carbon accounting tools, and give an overview and a worked example of how you can compute and calculate the greenhouse gas emissions of a farm business, which is effectively tonnes of CO2 equivalents per hectare per year and emissions intensity. So that session will probably go for, Karen will correct me if I'm wrong, about half an hour. Then we'll be followed by about half an hour of questions, and then we'll be finished. So now we've got a 15-minute break. So we'll see you back in at 10:15 Australian Eastern Standard Time. All right, everyone, welcome back. I probably should have said don't leave the webinar and try to rejoin because it can be clunky at times. I can see some people have left, but hopefully they've got a chance to rejoin. We only have one session left, which is carbon accounting, or how you can compute, or tools that can be used to estimate the tonnes of CO2 equivalents per farm business per year. So I'll hand over to my colleague, Dr. Karen Christie, and then we'll follow Karen's session with some Q&A, a general session. Over to you, Karen.
Thanks, Matt, and apologies, just as we were about to go live, we had a power blimp here and internet crashed, and now on my laptop with hotspotting to my mobile phone, so we'll give it a crack and see what happens. So yeah, we'll just, let's get going. So, slideshow. Okay, well, something's gone wrong there, but I'll just start with the first poll that I've got. And hopefully everyone can see this question now. So Rowan talked about land use change. This question's related to just what's happening on the farm for any particular year. How much does agriculture contribute to the national greenhouse gas emissions? So that's our things like our livestock, our nitrogen fertilizer, and the like. So it's not including land use change. If you've ripped out a whole lot of trees last year, it's not included. So wait and see how we're going. It's sort of a 50-50 between 15% and 25%. So sort of slowed down now, so I might just end the poll and share the results. And it sits at around 15%. It's actually, if you look at agriculture in totality, it's around 13%, but the power, like electricity and fuel usage, is counted in another segment of the emissions, the national emissions accounting, the same way that land use change is also counted in another section of the accounting. So we'll go to next question. Launch that. So this question is, again, excluding land use change, what do we think the typical greenhouse gas emissions per kilo of beef meat is? So for a kilo of meat, where do we think those numbers sit? The options are 6 kilos, 30 kilos, 18 kilos, and 12 kilos. And we're getting some answers that are all over the, answering for all of those options. So there's no clear winner at this moment in time. So this is also, yeah, I should have actually added as well, you're not offsetting any emissions through tree sequestration. It's just the pure emissions from the meat production. It seems to have slowed down, so I'll end the poll now and share the results. As I said, we've got, answers in all four segments. Generally speaking, it sits at around 9 to 18 kilos of CO2 per kilo of live weight. So really, any three of those answers could have been accurate. The 6 kilo, you're doing everything fantastically. 12 is about the midpoint, 18 the higher end of the scale, 30 kilos. If you were doing a carbon accounting and you got 30 kilos, there's room for improvement. Question 3. This one's similar to the beef question. We're not including land use change or any tree carbon sequestration or soil carbon sequestration. What is the typical greenhouse gas emissions per kilo of greasy wool? we've got 4 potentials there, 50 kilos, 20 kilos, 10 and 30. And again, the answers have started to slow down coming through, so I'll just end the poll there. And a kilo of greasy wool sits somewhere between that 20 to 30 kilos of CO2 equivalent per kilo of wool. If you're getting 10, you're doing a lot of fantastic things. You probably already are counting tree carbon or soil carbon sequestration. Similarly, if you're getting 50 kilos, you do a farm audit and you get 50 kilos, well, there's rooms for improvement.
One thing I'd say there, Karen, it just depends on how well people are reading the table in front of them, because we've got emissions intensity for wool in front of us. So it depends on how well they're reading that to answering the polls.
Exactly. So my apologies. This morning's blimp is stuffed everything up, but we'll keep on progressing through. So yeah, so I guess there's, the answers to those first question. Agriculture sits around 13%, land use change, which happens generally on agricultural land, will sequester around 5%. And so that's a year-on-year number. It's not that long-term change in carbon sequestration. And then, as Matt pointed out, these are results from Steve Wiedemann and others showing expected ranges. So it helps to know what you should probably be targeting, so that if you do an emissions calculation and your number is way wrong, it gives you an opportunity to go, well, have I entered data incorrectly, or is actually that what's my farm is doing? And so I've got plenty of room for improvement. So there's a whole range of currently available carbon calculators, both from Australia and from international, and I'm just going to touch on the main ones here. There's a whole suite of carbon calculators called the Greenhouse Accounting Framework, or the GAF tools, that have come out of Melbourne Uni. The website there is the PIC website. There's carbon calculators for horticulture, for sheep and beef, for feedlot beef, for dairy and cropping. There's also some for pork and poultry, and even buffalo, but I've just added there, I'd like to see camel next, because we do have lots of wild camels in Australia. But there's also a link to other tools. So there's a wine calculator, or a link to the wine calculator on that PIC website. And there's also a web-based hort carbon info calculator coming about mid-year. There is something called the the 030 beef carbon calculator. It's very much a web-based version of the BGAF calculators. The GAF calculators from Melbourne Uni, they're all standalone Excel. So you download them from that website, and they're a standalone Excel calculator, with the 030 beef it's a website-based one. There's also the farm gas calculator that come out of the Australian Farm Institute quite some, probably about 12 or so years ago. It is a web-based tool, but I would caution using it because it doesn't contain the most current national inventory, or the NGI, National Greenhouse Gas Inventory methodology. So it's not current and up to date. In terms of farm print, it's a CSIRO developed calculator that's pretty much initially, it's focused on the dryland broadacre cropping industries. And I've also had the 2 dairy carbon calculators, the Australian Dairy Carbon Calculator that we at TIA developed. You can access that from the Dairying for Tomorrow website. It's a standalone Excel-based calculator. And there's also Dairy Base, which is anyone from the dairy industry. It's a Dairy Australia program that's a web-based program that you can put your farm business and information in your herd dynamics, and you can also then do a carbon calculator. So they're looking at the emissions side of the ledger. Oh, sorry, there was one more. There's the Core Farm calculator, which is very similar to the GAF calculators, the Uni of Melbourne calculators. And it's a good calculator for international comparisons. It comes out of the UK, but I'd also premise that it doesn't contain Australian inventory methodologies, and so it will give you a different number compared to using what is considered the gold standard, which is the Uni of Melbourne GAF tools. But we also have a range of carbon sequestration calculators. There's the Socrates, which is a soil carbon calculator. It was developed by the Queensland University of Technology, and it can be found on the PIC website. There's a FullCam, which is a CSIRO developed calculator. It's how the Australian federal government determines what soil carbon and tree carbon sequestration is on a year-by-year basis. It's once you get your head around it, it's quite a useful tool. It's a free download from that website, and it goes into quite a lot of detail. So you put exactly where your farm is. You can pick the tree species for your particular farm, and you can pick the time frame. You can input management. So if you're thinning your trees out, or you have a prescribed burning of trees, or there's a whole range of management issues or options in there that you can explore. And the data that comes out of the FullCam is, if you were to do a full-on ERF or CSF methodology, it's that tool that underrides those calculations. There's also in some ways a more simpler. There's the Look-See calculator out there. It was also a CSIRO developed for Australian conditions. And what you do, it's at that website, you go in, you locate your farm. There's a map of Australia, you zoom into your area, and you answer a series of questions, and then the model will actually tell you what ERF methodologies you could participate in. If you know your area, and depending on the answers you've put in, you might be able to participate in a soil carbon program or project, or a tree carbon project. But there's also another range of tools that researchers like Matt and the rest of us use, the Rothenstedt carbon model and DayCent and the like. So there's a whole suite of carbon sequestration calculators is also available out there. I missed the start, but I do believe most of the farmers that are in this webinar today are sort of beef and sheep farmers. So I'm just going to run through fairly briefly the sheep beef GAF calculator, and then I'll also look at the horticulture or the cropping model. But a lot of these tools, the premises or the questions are all very similar. So if we just run this through the sheep beef calculator, now we have a beef and sheep calculator that's all combined. At one stage there was a beef calculator and a sheep calculator, and they said they were separate. What's important, it's based on Australia's national inventory. So it uses specific equations and emission factors that are relevant for Australian conditions. As we've talked about, it's an annual time set, so it's the net emissions for the year of assessment. It converts methane and nitrous oxide into carbon dioxide equivalents, so we can compare them on a similar warming potential. This is something Matt's touched on. You know, it calculates net emissions, so your total emissions minus any carbon sequestered in trees. So it includes those scope 1, 2 emissions. And it, depending on which tool you're using, with the sheep beef calculator, it presents the results as a kilo of CO2 per kilo of live weight and per kilo of greasy fleece weight. But in terms of carbon footprints, depending on what your industry is, it could be kilos per kilo of crop. You could have kilograms of CO2 per hectare or kilograms per kilo of protein. What's really important with any of these calculators is the accuracy of the information you put in. The whole premise of, you know, rubbish in equals rubbish out. You know, there are also some inputs that are highly sensitive. So stock numbers is a highly sensitive parameter. If you've got 300 cows versus 350 cows, that will make a big difference to your emissions profile. If your electricity is 10,000 kilowatts per annum or 11,000 kilowatts per annum, it's going to make less impact on the overall carbon footprint. And for the sheep beef calculator, there's a manual at that website, and we'll try and get that link into the chat box. It's a really helpful manual to work people through the calculator. So what I will do, and then there's another slide I think I need to do. So when you first open a lot of these, in particular sheep beef calculator, but a lot of these GAF calculators, the ones out of Melbourne Uni, you have a question which will have to enable this macro. So there'll be a question up the top that will ask you to enable the contents. It's completely safe to touch and to hit that. So you need to hit that to progress the calculator. I found once you've already opened the calculator, so once you've downloaded it from the Melbourne Uni site and you've opened the calculator, sometimes that macro question then disappears. It seems to be just when you open it for the first time. What they have done is already populated the carbon sequestration sheet. So I will show you once we go into the calculator that if you go to the results page first and you can see any results, and I can guarantee when you open the calculator for the first time, there will probably be some carbon sequestration in trees there. So you need to go in and remove that information. And so what you do is basically go in and you'll delete sort of any of that information, your state, region, etc. But it's important to know that there are some limitations to this calculator. For example, it doesn't estimate soil carbon sequestration or loss. There's also only a few tree species available. And it doesn't estimate, land use change. So if you removed a whole lot of tree vegetation last year so that you can increase grazing land, it doesn't take that into consideration. So, what Ram was talking about earlier, the need to, these calculators just really focus on the emissions and give you some options in terms of tree veg, but it doesn't look at that bigger picture of that land use change. So if I stop sharing there and then open calculator, and then I need to, what is that I'm sharing? Go to what's going on here? Sorry, folks, I can't see my spreadsheet. We'll go to this one first. Oh, actually, we won't. We'll go about a little bit back to front. So this is the grains calculator. My apologies. I'll try and get the sheep one up next. But this is the grains calculator. So along the bottom, you have a whole range of tabs. Hopefully you can see my mouse. This is the data summary. So this is the results page. As I said, when you open a calculator for the first time, I always suggest coming in here and deleting any information in terms of tree vegetation. And then go back to your crops. So there's a series of questions. So the first question is, well, where are you in the country? I'm currently in Tasmania, so I'll say Tasmania. Our electricity source, you'll have two options, either state grid or renewable. And then there's a series, you can enter up to 5 crops. So even though they're named wheat, barley, legumes, triticale, and oilseeds, and there's a drop-down list, those headings are just so you can follow the results. So if you looked at this and you went, actually, I have, I don't know, let's say I have poppies, for example. And poppies are not down there. The closest is oilseeds, maybe. That's not going to change the results. It's just a way of knowing that when you go to the results page, you can see that first column is related to the oilseeds. The next question is about whether it's non-irrigated or irrigated, sugarcane, cotton, or horticulture. And then one of the important questions is, and it's a bit hard to know on this map, but the question is, are you in this orange zone? So this orange zone is basically the interior of Australia where the risk of nitrate leaching is extremely low. Most of the area that's either higher rainfall or irrigated will be outside of this orange zone. And so most soils in Australia have a potential to be leached. So here in Tasmania, the answer would be no. And then there's a series of questions, you know, what's your average yield per year on a tonnes per hectare basis? How much area did you sow? Because this is cropping, most of the factors are related to nitrogen fertiliser or a range of fertilisers and lime. We want to know if you burnt the crop after, or the residual after you've harvested the crop. In terms of fuel production and electricity inputs. And the question here will be, what's your total electricity usage? So you won't necessarily know if you put, you know, 2,000 kilowatt hours into your wheat crop or 1,500 into your oats crop. You'll just probably have a total number. And so then you try and then allocate, well, what do you think that is per crop? And the pesticide and herbicide usage. And then once you've entered all those numbers, you can then go and look at your results. So, you know, for example, this is the oil seeds, but we use that as a surrogate for poppies. You've got your on-farm emissions, so your scope 1 emissions, total 108. Electricity, because we're renewable, it's 0 in terms of scope 2. We brought in some fertiliser and herbicide, and there was some fuel and lime. So that totaled 38 tonnes of CO2 for the particular year of assessment, totaling 146. And so the emissions intensity, so the kilos of CO2 equivalent per kilo of crop was about 0.24 for this particular crop. Now, I don't know if those numbers are accurate. I'm not a poppy grower, but I've just sort of used that as an example template to show you through the results. If you did have some trees on farm and you wanted to offset some of your emissions with those trees, you would answer these series of questions. And it's really important that you start from the top and you work your way down the sheet. So we might be on the northwest with our poppies. We had, you've got an option, series of options there. For Tasmania, there's a mixed species, some blue gums, shining gums, and radiata pines. So we'll go with mixed species. A couple of soil types. Generally speaking, soil type won't impact on the potential of sequestering carbon, but we asked that question. And the area of the trees, so we've got 25 hectares, and we planted the trees 10 years ago. And we're going to allocate 100% of that to because that's all we're growing on this farm is the poppies. So if we go to the summary page, we can see whilst we sequestered around 160 tonne of CO2, our trees, because we had such an area of trees, we actually offsetted more than we produced in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. So our net emissions were negative, and our emissions intensity therefore is also negative. We'll stop sharing that screen and try and get the sheep one up now. Hopefully with a bit more success. Yep. Okay, so hopefully everyone can see now a new spreadsheet there. Walking through it, the first page is an introduction, similar to the horticulture one or the cropping tools. There's a results page. And what I've done is basically I've already entered in a sheep and beef farm enterprise into both these sheets. If we just walk through very quickly the sheep calculator, because we've got livestock, there's a few more questions. Both sheets are very similar. So the first question is we want to know livestock numbers for each stock class. So for our rams or wethers, our breeding ewes and the like. We want to know for each of the 4 seasons of the year. So for at the moment, they're labeled spring, summer, autumn and winter. Now, what you can do, you can say, well, actually I lamb in the 1st of August. So I will treat my spring as those first 3 months post lambing. So spring becomes August, September, October. Summer becomes then November, December, January. As long as you follow that same pattern, that the first series of the 4 seasons is our first 3 months of production of our farm production year, and you follow through that. So basically, yeah, needing to enter your sheep numbers on a seasonal basis, their live weight on a seasonal basis. So this is the midpoint. So the midpoint of the first 3 months, the breeding ewes for this example is around 48 kilos. They put a little bit of weight on just before they put on as I was still growing before they got to point of lambing. We need to have some understanding of their live weight gain or loss over each of the 4 seasons. There are in the sheep calculator and the beef calculators a series of already imported information that comes from the National Inventory. Anything that's grey like this, we suggest you leave it as is, unless you have and I'll talk about that in a very brief moment of when we get to digestible protein. But for the most part, leave the numbers as they are. This particular farm brought in some rams, so they bought 10 rams each year at 80 kilos, and they were merino rams. But we also sold both rams and some wethers and ewes and lambs for that particular year of assessment. So it's important when you, excuse me, entering information up here. For example, I said I started at 1,500 breeding ewes. I dropped down to 1,250 because I sold 250 ewes, then come down and enter that information in here. Also, we want to know, because it's a sheep farm, we want to know the wool that's come off that particular farm in terms of numbers shorn, kilo of greasy weight, and what the percentage of clean wool yield was. The proportion of ewes lambing, we want to know when did the lambs, all the ewes lamb. So if you only lamb 1 time a year, so it's springtime, the answer will be 100%. If you were split lambing and you had, I don't know, 2/3 lambing in spring and a third lambing in autumn, for example, you would have 67% lambing in spring and 33% lambing in autumn. The seasonal lambing rate is your fecundity period or number. It's like, okay, I had 100 ewes, but I only got 87 lambs off that. That were live lambs that survived those first 2 or 3 days. So we tend to think about the seasonal lambing rates as actually weaning rates. So of all the ewes that lambed, what percentage of lambs did we get from them? The next 2 questions around protein and digestibility, again on a seasonal basis. If you think, for example, in summertime, your crude protein is a bit higher, you can either go to the feed quality tab down the bottom and change, or you can just override the information in here. So you might go, okay, it should be closer to 20%, for example. Excuse me. The next, there's only a couple more questions now. We need to know about our urea fertilizer inputs, any superphosphate and lime, and our fuel and electricity usage. And so I've done that for the beef farm as well. I won't go into the information in that, but it very much follows that same pattern. And then we can see a results page broken down into all the different sources, and we can see on this pie chart on the right hand side that enteric methane, because of the livestock farm, we're about 74% of emissions for this particular farm. It comes from enteric methane. And in the interest of, and then actually, sorry, I should scroll down. This particular farm, I hadn't put any trees in yet, so producing around 2,340 odd tonne of CO2 equivalents. And then it breaks it down into the 3 products in terms of sheep meat, beef meat, and wool. And I might just leave it there and pass back to Matt.
Thanks very much, Karen. Now we do have one more thing to do. It's just a quick poll, and then we will hand it over to the floor for questions. And you can start putting questions in the Q&A now if you haven't done already. We can also have an opportunity for people to raise their hands, and we can get our expert IT man to give you audio control, and we can ask questions in an audio sense. I'm going to see if I can bring up the polls again. Now, this poll that I'm launching here is labelled end of workshop, but it's not technically the end of workshop. We've still got Q&A. It's got a number of questions in it. So it's really what you think of today, what you thought of the different parts of today, really what you want more of, what you thought was boring, what you liked, what you didn't like, and really gives us help for improving next time. Hopefully you can see those on your screen now. I'm worried that people can't see them because I haven't got any responses at all. So just feel free to click on, if you can see those polls, click on it. Yep, people are entering them now, which is good. So just carry away and answer those. We've only got 4 people who've answered so far. So I'll just give you a few minutes to answer those. I think if you scroll down, there should be a little window. If you actually scroll your mouse down, or depending on if you're on a PC or on your phone, you should be able to scroll down. There's actually 8 different questions in there. So thanks very much for the 40 people who have already entered their responses. Because there's 8 questions there, I'll give you a little bit more time. And then we'll hand over for questions to the panel. And we've had some very interesting questions in the Q&A already, which is really good. Now, if there's anyone else who wants to answer those end of workshop questions, that'd be really good. I think about only half of people have responded so far. I might stop there. I'll actually share the results just to see, just so that other people can see what other people thought of the workshop. And so we won't go over this in detail. Most people thought the workshop was good. Some people, well, luckily most people didn't think it was boring. Most people didn't think it was horrible, which was good. A lot of people learnt stuff from today. The workshop was too long. Most people didn't think it was too long. And do people prefer face-to-face? We've got a range of answers there. People think sort of mixed answers there. Half of people think they would like face-to-face, others not so. And a lot of people seem to like the online delivery method. There's one other question. This is the final poll question, so thanks very much for your patience. I'll just get you to answer this one question. This is a multiple choice one. And really the question is why you attended today. After attending today, you would like more information on carbon accounting tools, greenhouse gas emissions, livestock supplements, planting trees, co-benefits and trade-offs. What do you really need more info on? So this is very important, and this will help us tailor the workshops for next time. So if you could have a go at answering that and select all that apply or none. hopefully people can see that on their screen. If you can't see it, just put it in the chat, or so we've got about 60 responses. So just in the interest of time, I'll cut that off now, and I'll just let other people know what the results are. As is typical with a distribution of people of different ages, different occupations and different locations, you get a distribution of answers. So there's no clear-cut answer. Some people want more info on carbon farming, where to start, how to make a farm carbon neutral, costs, accounting tools. Not many people have said they've got all the info they need. Some people need, well, about half of people want more info on livestock supplements. So there's a range of answers there. So thanks very much for that. I'm hoping that I haven't missed any questions. So people on the panel, let me know if I have. But otherwise, what we're going to do now is hand over to participants for questions. Now, if anyone wants to raise their hand and ask a question verbally, that's fine, go ahead, and we can transfer control so that people can ask or answer, ask questions in a verbal sense. Otherwise, we will have to work through the Q&A. So I've had a go at answering some of the Q&A already, and we've got 9 open questions in there now. Karen, by the looks, most of them are for you from that session now. We haven't got any people who've raised their hands. Andrew said, can you zoom in on the orange zone? So that's probably past the fact now, but you can actually zoom in on that spreadsheet, Andrew. Anna said, if you have a cotton farm that also grows chickpeas and wheat, would you use just the grains gaff, or would you use both the cotton gaff and the grains gaff and try to split out the overheads between the two? So the question was basically, if you've got cotton and chickpeas and wheat, do you use both greenhouse gas accounting tools, or do you use one and try to merge them in together, or do you split out the overheads between the two? So I'll hand that one over to you, Karen. You're muted, Karen. One of the most common sayings in a Zoom session.
At least I'm working. Yes, thank you, Anna, and thank you, Matt, for pointing out that out. Yes, thanks, Anna. Fantastic question. I would suggest, if you can easily segment the businesses, it would give you an opportunity, but you can also to use the 2 calculators, but I think you can also use that same, the one grains calculator, and then you can have the whole carbon footprint of the whole farm all together. I think I would suggest probably just trying the grains first. I don't envisage there'd be any questions related specifically to cotton that are not part of the grains calculator. Cropping or horticulture very much focuses on your nitrogen fertilizer and your other fertilizer inputs, your electricity and diesel and the like. So I'd imagine they'd be pretty much the same. The answer should be the same for both calculators, and so I'd suggest using the one calculator, the grains calculator, to do that.
Thanks, Karen. The next question was from Nola or Noel. I'm sorry I've pronounced your name wrong. And the question was, in the grain calculator, the scope 1 emissions pie chart doesn't equal scope 1 emissions in the table. So it sounds to me as if there's a glitch. Have you noticed that before, Karen, or not?
I must admit, I'm not 100% across the grains and horticulture calculators. I'll have to go back and take that on notice. Yes, I'll have to take that on notice, but I'll check that out.
So that's a very good comment. Thanks for,
yeah,
thanks for pointing that out. That could well be a technical glitch. So Paul asked a question regarding the SB-GAF calculator. If you change management to reduce methane emissions, such as genetics or feed additives, but there's no productivity gain, will it be recognised in the results?
No, that's a great question, Paul, and it's one of the limitations of the calculators is that it just really focuses on currently the emission side of things. It's developed focused on the national inventory, and I know the Australian federal government is trying to work through, well, how does it capture that information on farm where people are feeding an additive? For example, most people would be well aware of asparagopsis can have anywhere up to a 90% reduction in enteric methane, and that's going to be a bit of a game changer for the livestock industries, and the calculators don't pick that up at this moment in time. So it's a pretty much watch this space. What we have done to date in our modelling work is, if we know that enteric methane, for example, can be reduced by a percentage, and we've got the science to back that up, we just then go in and manually change that calculator. That's for your own benefit, but it won't stand up in none of these calculators will stand up as a proof to then go and participate in an emissions reduction fund or any voluntary marketplace. Those carbon accreditation programs will go down a different pathway. They'll probably use the same calculations, but they will go down that pathway in a different way. I guess it's we're rapidly changing in this space, Paul, with things coming online relatively quickly, and is one of the limitations of the calculators.
Thanks, Karen. The next question was from Melinda Bain. Hopefully I pronounced the name right again. Apologies if I didn't. RDA Tasmania are working on a strategic regional plan for the state. Ag and carbon are critical to Tasmania and to the plan. Melinda's questions are, what's the biggest challenges for farmers taking action regarding greenhouse gas emissions? And the second one was, what role should government play vis-a-vis farmers play? So what's the biggest challenge for farmers taking action regarding greenhouse gas emissions? Well, that's very much context specific. So it depends on what agroecological region they are, what enterprise they run, and their existing state. So if you're a farmer that, shall we say, has embarked on the carbon farming journey a long time ago, have very high soil carbon stocks of 5 or 6 or 7%, have a large proportion of trees on farm, feed livestock supplements, there's probably not a lot you can do. If you're a farmer that's just bought a farm, it's degraded, it's got very low ground cover, it's got a lot of rabbits in the woodlands that eat your pastures and consume pastures as well, then you've got massive potential for improvement in your carbon stocks. So it really depends on where you are in your existing state, but also your region. If you're in a high rainfall region, above 400 millimetres a year, you've got good potential for carbon sequestration. If you're in the centre of Australia, where you get low 200 millimetres annual average rainfall, there's probably not a lot of potential for improving soil carbon or indeed planting trees. So you might want to focus on, depending on what your enterprise is, pathways for improving animal health. And so if you get rid of unproductive animals and you cull unproductive cows and you try to fatten up livestock faster and sell them earlier, that's avoiding methane. So it's very much context specific. So it's a good question, but it's case by case basis, that one. The second question was, what role should government play versus farmers? So government, I think, have a big role to play, and Caroline Brown, who we all heard from earlier, talked about the carbon farming advice rebate scheme. I think that's particularly important. Incentivisation from a government side of things via carbon farming policies is particularly important, and communication. I think government also have a role to play in leadership. So depending on whether it's state or Commonwealth government, in getting the carbon farming story out there and introducing appropriate policies that engender participation. So a good example is the carbon farming method that was predicted by a model, by Fulcam. No one really took it up because the carbon estimates from the model were so conservative that it just wasn't worth doing. It just didn't pay. The costs of participation in getting a consultant to enrol you and certify you were much more than the money that you got from carbon, unless you're a massive property. So government has a big role to play in policies, I think. Farmers, well, the farmers have the opportunity to be champions or leaders in their own right. And many farmers are already champions in their own right, but I think those leading farmers have got a good opportunity to communicate with others and to teach others the good news stories they've learned, as well as the bad news stuff about the carbon farming journey, really, what's worked and what hasn't worked. So peer-to-peer learning is a big one. It's a pity we can't have, we haven't got the opportunity to raise hands. If people want to raise hands, that's fine, and we can have a more interactive discussion. Otherwise, I'll just move on to the next question. Jan Hamilton said, how are natural losses accounted for in SB-GAF? Do you want to have a go at that one, Karen?
Jan. Yeah, certainly. Thanks, Jan. When we look at each of the 3 seasons, you're trying to determine the average of that 3-month period. And so what you need to do is then what I did when I put up that spreadsheet, it was a very simplified farm system. I said, we had 1,500 odd ewes, lamb at the start of spring. They were there for 6. Well, no, actually, I think I had them there for 9 months before we sold a fifth of them. It was a very simplified version. So what you need to do with your farm is go, okay, well, what's the average number for the first 3 months of the year, the second, third and fourth months, and actually enter those information in. So yes, we will have natural attrition losses. For example, we tend to, with our lambs, and to some degree also because we have, we have levels of lamb mortality on sheep farms, which generally speaking, cattle farms, you generally get a live calf and that will go through to be grown out. But with lambs in particular, I tend to look at it, well, how many lambs did we take through to weaning and to sale? We know, unfortunately, for a range of reasons, we might lose a percentage of lambs in those first 2 or 3 days. Because they're only been there for 2 or 3 days on the farm, we don't count their emissions because they haven't started emitting any methane. So we want to know, what are the numbers of animals that are retained on farm for a duration.
Thanks, Karen. The next question was from Veronica. Can you provide insight into how the finance sector and lenders are looking at farmers and carbon responsibilities? Now, I can't talk for all banks, but I know some big banks, for example, the Commonwealth Bank, have got low interest rate loans. And so they're very much depending on what actions farmers are willing to implement, low interest rate loans. So you can get very low interest rate green loans, I think they're called. Don't ask me about the technical detail, but those loans are given specifically to plant trees or to improve soil carbon or to revegetate waterways or to improve biodiversity. So I guess if you wanted more detail on that, Veronica, probably have a look at the bank's website. So that's called a green loan. I think there's other loans that are sustainability linked loans. So they're to do your typical farm operations, but in a more sustainable, carbon friendly, carbon farming sort of way. And that might be things like, thinking about renewable energy, potentially biodiesel, so stuff like that. So the individual detail, improvement in natural capital is another one. And I think they offer a discount on the default interest rate. So probably just have a look at the bank website. So there's a lot of stuff happening in that area at the moment. And I know we work in a large research project in across the entire eastern seaboard of Australia. It's called the Nexus Project. Some of the farmers in Central Australia have said the only reason they're interested in carbon is because they can access low interest rate loans, because the banks are asking for, things like carbon neutrality and climate change adaptation and stuff like that. So the next comment was from Anna. If you're dealing with a mixed livestock system, that is the majority of livestock, but still has a significant cropping enterprise, would you try to use both the SB-GAF and the grains GAF and split the overheads between the two? So similar to the earlier question, Karen.
Yeah, thanks, Anna. Look, I think over time there might be an evolution where you'll have this SB-GAF calculator also have a grains calculation as part of the whole suite, because a lot of mixed livestock will have both livestock and cropping. But for the moment, yes, try and use the livestock or use the SB calculator to SB-GAF calculator for your livestock, use your grains calculator, then you can bring those numbers together and do that assessment. That then keeps, nitrogen fertilizer and electricity and diesel usage for your grains separate from your your sheep and your beef, so that your emissions intensity would reflect the true breakdown of emissions that are related to the livestock versus the grain.
Thanks, Karen. Christopher asked a question, which is a very good one, and I don't think, that's not to say the others weren't good, but I don't think we can answer this one. What's the availability, with the availability of these tools that you demonstrated, Karen, to calculate emissions and sequestration? Do we have info on the use and uptake of these tools by farmers? What tool is mostly used, and how's this translated to actual decisions to decrease emissions? So that's an adoption and impact question, which is usually fundamental to most research projects, and we would be very interested to know the answer to that one ourselves. So very happy to team up with people if they're thinking about adoption and impact. And Karen, I don't have a feel for that, the answer to that at all. I don't know whether you have any thoughts.
Yeah, it's a great question. Like that suite of tools and calculators that I put up, some of them are standalone Excel spreadsheets, like the ones I've shown today. Others are web-based, and so when they're web-based, for example, the dairy calculator that comes out of Rebate, Dairy Australia can get a real feel for how many people are going in and using the tool, and so they're getting that live feedback. When they're standalones, I tend to only know about people using the calculators when they have, issues with them or want more information. They'll ring up and say, Karen, what does this question really asking of me? So that's how I know when calculators are being used. That said, a lot of the calculators are being used by researchers and consultants, and so there's more and more consultants out there that are actually using these calculators with their suite of farmers to calculate these emissions. And I'll touch on, for example, Steve Wiedemann, who's with Integrity Ag and Environment, recently did something like 200 odd carbon footprints for beef and sheep farms around Australia, and so the calculators are being used widely, but it's hard to gather that information together to know who's actually using those calculators, which is the most used and most effective in that calculation. But I think in terms of the last bit of the question, how does this translate into actual reduction changes? Like anything, if you don't measure your production, it's hard to know how your livestock or your crops are going. If you went out and harvested your crops and you had no idea if you grew a 3-ton wheat crop or a 20-ton wheat crop, if you had no numbers to back yourself up, you don't know how you're doing. So, and I think the calculators are used in that same way. It's a first opportunity to get a feel for, well, where are my emissions coming from? And it gives you an opportunity then to go, okay, like, for example, if, I'm taking 2 years to finish off my steers to say 550 kilos, if I can actually just finish them 3 months earlier, still at that 550 kilos, well, what does that do to my emissions profile? And it could be a quick way to get a feel for what are the sensitivities to emissions, and how can I actually implement management practices on farm to reduce our footprint.
Thanks, Karen. I just remind people to try to put their questions in the Q&A rather than the chat. I can see there's a couple of big questions in the chat. I'll go to the chat shortly, but try to put them in the Q&A. Feel free to ask any more, any questions at all. There's no silly or stupid questions, any at all. So Charles asked a very good question. It's probably better framed at someone from government. Have you found data collection in terms of what types of projects most ACCUs are coming from difficult? Are there any sources or databases that you prefer? So the first part of that question, where are ACCUs most generated in most projects? If you look up the Commonwealth Government website, there's a graph on there and there's a map, and it shows the registrations of current projects, piggeries versus forestry versus land use, and it shows the adoption of ACCUs over time. So that's on the Commonwealth Government website. I can't tell you the exact website, but it's somewhere on there. I've seen it before. Are there any sources or databases that you prefer? I haven't actually any research databases. I just tend to use that Commonwealth Government one. I don't know whether any of the other panelists are aware of other databases with project registrations for ACCUs. Karen, Rowan? Dominic?
No.
No. It's okay. Now I'll go over to the chat. We're nearly finished. So thanks very much for everyone's patience. So Emma asked a question, are there any accounting tools for biodiversity aside from accounting for nature? Very good question. And I don't know the answer to that. Actually, I do know the answer. There is ANU, Andrew McIntosh, generated a tool, and I don't know the exact name. I think it's the National Biodiversity or National Environmental Stewardship Program or something. If you Google that, you will get something. That project is nearing completion. I think it's quite a big one. That will have some sort of accounting tool in it for biodiversity. That's all I know, but I know that project's nearly finished. Indra and I asked a question for Rowan. Do you have a resource or a link that we could access to learn more about the land use efficiency versus production versus carbon problem? Thank you.
That's probably more of an agronomic question. It depends on what you're producing, but anything that increases your productivity is good, which is generally what farmers are trying to do anyway, I think. So do any of the agronomists have anything to say about that?
Well, there's a lot of resources out there. There's a lot of resources and links for land use stuff. I'm not aware of, well, I'm not sure about the background of the person who asked the question, whether it's a research question or whether it's a practitioner sort of a question. There probably are a lot of tools out there in a research setting. I'm not quite sure about. So most of our agricultural tools, such as those that Karen showed, don't have land use change in them. So they account for productivity and sequestration yearly. So for example, you had half of your farmer's trees the year before you use that calculator, then you deforest and you lose all of that carbon. That won't be counted in the calculation. So the important point that Rowan was getting at is that just be aware of the caveats of all tools. Land use change is a big source of emissions. And if you've changed land use in a significant way, just be aware that there's probably a lot of emissions associated with that change. So for example, deforestation in the Amazon is a big one. So for example, we embark on carbon farming stuff in Australia. If if the carbon price has changed, for example, it could push food production and productivity over to South America. That could result in more deforestation sort of thing. So there's, as I said at the start of the presentation, there's a big difference between carbon neutral farm versus carbon neutral country, and ultimately the atmosphere is what experiences net zero. So we probably do have to be net zero at the global scale. But anyway,
can I just say something else about that? If you increase your production on a particular area of land, then your emissions, so if you increase your fodder production, and so you can increase your stocking your stocking rate, your emissions will actually go up. So if you use a calculator like Karen showed you, well, of course, you've got more livestock, your emissions will go up. But actually, from a point of view of doing that globally, the overall footprint goes down because you're using less land to produce that, but it's not counted. So there's some cases where you actually get the opposite result.
Yeah, be aware of perverse outcomes. I mean, if you improve your production and put on more nitrogen, you'll increase emissions, but emissions intensity will probably go down. So the emissions per unit product would go down. A measure of efficiency is the kilograms of CO2 per unit product. So the lower that is, the better. But in the end, the atmosphere only sees total emissions. And so that's what contributes to warming. So in the end, it's total emissions to the atmosphere that contributes to global warming or mitigates it. So that's really what's important in the end.
If you reduce your production and that production goes somewhere else, it's still happening, but you're only measuring what's happening on your farm. So
that's right. Yep. So that's a global question. That's really probably a research question. So if people here on the line today are farmers or agronomists or state government people, I guess, unless there's anyone from the UNFCCC on the line, there's probably a question for another time. But Frank had a question there. I think it was more of a statement. Is anyone planning to build dust-free roads on farms and rural regions? And he had a big comment there about biochar. So I'm not sure if people have seen that in the chat, and there's some technical presentations there. And he said there's no such thing as waste in nature, just wasted opportunities. Now I'll go back to I'm getting questions in the Q&A, which is good. So thanks very much to Emma, who was asked a question. Are there any accounting tools for biodiversity co-benefits? Probably similar to the other comment about biodiversity accounting per se, Emma. Check out the National Australian Stewardship, Environmental Stewardship portal, I think it's called. Now, I don't remember the exact terminology, but it's generated by Andrew McIntosh at ANU. So if you Google that, you might find something on there. Rowan, are you aware of any biodiversity accounting tools? I'm not.
Not off the top of my head, but we can have a look into that. If we got a way of getting information out to people afterwards, probably not really.
If people want slides or the recording, send me an email. I've put the email in the chat. I'll put the email in the chat again, and we can circulate the recording to this Zoom as well as the slides and any other info that people want. So potentially biodiversity accounting tools. There's been a comment in the chat, projects across Australia. Thanks very much for that. That's the Clean Energy Regulator one, and that's the exact link that I was talking about with the map of projects. So thanks for that. Indranai said that it's the National Stewardship Trading Platform. That's it, exactly. Thanks very much for that. So if you Google National Stewardship Trading Platform, Emma, you'll find a lot of stuff in there. So I'm not completely up to speed with the details of it, but it's in there. Caroline Brown said that the Carbon Market Institute has a database for information of carbon offset projects. So there we go. That's very useful as well. So that's in the chat if people can see that. So that's marketplace.carbonmarketinstitute.org.registry. Kerry Bridle said that La Trobe Uni has a natural capital accounting project led by Jim Radford, which is useful. Thanks very much for that. And Indranai also included a link to the Australian Agricultural Sustainability Framework. Now, there's another question from an anonymous attendee in the Q&A. When you discussed how you could increase carbon in the soil, you mentioned the use of nitrogen fertiliser and irrigation. Do you think that endorsing the use of both has the potential to alter farming enterprises, for example, changing from sheep and cattle? This is something that's spreading throughout Tasmania, and I believe the resulting land is being used for the wrong land use, and in fact, probably because resulting in larger carbon emissions. So if I understand that question correctly, so for example, for context, for other people not in Tasmania, there's a lot of irrigated land use expansion in Tasmania, particularly in central Tasmania and in the north. So that is resulting in changes in land use practice from typically sheep and beef to higher value stuff like poppies and dairy and whatever else. It depends, farm dependent. So the question was, I think I mentioned that you could increase carbon in soil through the use of nitrogen fertiliser and irrigation. That's correct. So depending on your fertility, if you improve dry matter production above ground, you generally will improve soil carbon. If you add irrigation, you generally will improve soil carbon if it's previously dry land, provided you keep irrigating and you keep adding nutrients so that they don't go down again. Otherwise, soil carbon will drop again. The second part of that question was, do you think endorsing the use of both nitrogen and irrigation has the potential to alter farming system practices from sheep and cattle to cropping? I think the question is. Well, I guess probably one point to make, and it's a significant disclaimer, is that we're not recommending anything in the webinar. We're just talking about the facts. And if people want further information, send me an email or send anyone else an email, and we can refer you to peer-reviewed scientific literature, which has been studied and reviewed by scientific peers. In terms of changing from sheep and cattle enterprises into cropping, again, that's very context specific. But for example, if you remove livestock and you convert it to cropping, in general, whole farm emissions, this is a broad statement, will generally go down because enteric methane emissions usually dominate greenhouse gas emissions profiles of farms. So you'll get an increase in nitrous oxide, you'll get a decrease in enteric methane. That's generally what would happen if you change from livestock to cropping. But again, it depends on the magnitude of the change. So I hope that answered your question. This is something that's spreading throughout Tasmania, and I believe is being used for the wrong land use, and in fact probably resulting in larger carbon emissions. So it's probably resulting in more nitrous oxide emissions, that's right, but it would be reducing enteric methane if there's less livestock. So Emma said, Emma just said thank you, and I think we've probably reached the end of the question. I know Kerry's got another comment there. There seems to be quite a bit of stubble burning this year. Stubble burning is basically just a direct release of greenhouse gas of CO2 into the atmosphere. And depending on where you are, if you're in a dry rainfall environment, stubble conserves soil moisture. And so that can result in improved crop productivity the next year. So I'd encourage people not to burn, to just lay the stubble on the surface, but it depends how thick your stubble is. You might not be able to sow your crop in the following year. And so there's a lot of stubble burning in central Victoria, mainly from tradition, but I don't think it's really that good in terms of CO2 emissions. Another question there from Kerry, how do we do better with respect to stubble management, especially on rocky ground? What I would recommend is to conserve the stubble, to lay it over on the surface. If you lay it over on the surface, it'll break down quicker because it's in contact with the soil surface, so the bugs can get at the carbon and break it down, as opposed to standing up horizontally. It also improves water conservation. So if you have a dry summer and you have rainfall, it prevents soil evaporation. And I know traditionally, I think farmers have burnt stubble because their machine, their cultivator, in the following year can't get through the stubble, it blocks up. And that's still practiced in some areas, but it's a direct release of CO2 emissions. And you're also getting rid of some of the nutrients that you put on in the fertilizer in the previous year. So I'd encourage, unless they absolutely have to, try not to burn stubble. Stubble management on rocky ground, well, that's a good point. There's probably some context where you do have to do it. And particularly if you've got big boulders on your paddock, dookie and those areas sometimes have large rocks and stuff. So, there's some cases where you may have to do it, but some farmers even bale it. They actually harvest it or windrow it after the header goes and puts the stubble into a row, and then they come along and bale the straw and sell the straw. So you can get direct benefit if you're actually wanting to get stubble off your farm. But I'd encourage people just to keep it because it's a source of carbon. And I think that's about it. So Frank said co-composting of carbon-rich biomass and various other nutrient-rich organics on farms is growing. Thanks, Frank. Indrani said, thanks very much for your time and expertise. It's important for us to learn more about carbon farming and move towards CN30. Thanks very much. And Kerry said, thank you. So we might call it quits there. Thanks very much for everyone's time. It's been a long session. I hope it was useful. I'll put my email in the chat again if people want access to the slides or the presentations or the other stuff that we've talked about. We'll put a couple of links in that email as well. I'll probably get bombarded with emails now, but we might leave it there. Thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you.
See you all.